March 23, 1945. Captain Robert Marshall of the 332nd Fighter Group dropped his P-51 Mustang to barely 200 feet above the Brenner Pass, the snow-capped Alps rising like cathedral walls on either side of him. The morning air was crisp and clear, visibility extending for miles in every direction, the kind of weather that made pilots grateful and nervous in equal measure. His wingmen, flying in tight formation behind him, thought he was conducting a routine reconnaissance sweep. They had no idea he was about to rewrite the tactical manual for ground attack operations in mountainous terrain, or that his observations this morning would solve a problem that had frustrated Allied commanders for months. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Marshall discovered that frigid morning would transform him from a defeated pilot into a legend among the Tuskegee Airmen, proving that innovation born from necessity could achieve what overwhelming firepower could not. His approach would become a case study in tactical thinking, taught in military academies for generations to come. But more than that, it would stand as yet another testament to the excellence of pilots who had to fight not just against a foreign enemy, but against the prejudice of their own country. The story of how Robert Marshall came to be flying combat missions over the Alps began years earlier, in the segregated America of the 1930s and early 40s. Born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1918, Marshall had grown up in a family that valued education and perseverance. His father worked in a steel mill, his mother as a schoolteacher. They had instilled in their son a belief that excellence was the best response to injustice, that achievement spoke louder than protests, though protests had their place as well. Marshall had developed his fascination with aviation as a teenager, spending hours at the Cleveland Municipal Airport watching aircraft take off and land. He had read every book about flying he could find, studied the principles of aerodynamics, and dreamed of one day piloting his own aircraft. But in the 1930s, the idea of a black man flying for the military seemed as impossible as walking on the moon. Then came the war. As America mobilized for conflict, pressure mounted to include black Americans in all aspects of the military effort. The result was the creation of the program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, where black men would be trained as military pilots. The program was as much an experiment as a training initiative. Many in the military establishment believed that black men lacked the intelligence, coordination, and courage required for aerial combat. The Tuskegee program existed partly to prove them right, to demonstrate that the segregation of military aviation was justified by performance rather than prejudice. Marshall applied to the program in 1942, passing rigorous tests that eliminated the majority of applicants, regardless of race. The selection process was deliberately harsh. The program's organizers knew that every failure would be used as evidence of racial inferiority, while successes would be dismissed as exceptions. Marshall and his fellow candidates faced standards that exceeded those applied to white pilot candidates, a reality they accepted with determination rather than complaint. The training at Tuskegee was intensive and unforgiving. Marshall learned to fly in PT-17 Stearmans, progressed to BT-13 Valiants, and eventually transitioned to AT-6 Texans before finally earning his wings in the aircraft he would fly in combat, the P-51 Mustang. Every phase of training pushed candidates to their limits. The washout rate was high, and those who remained knew they were being held to a higher standard than their white counterparts. But rather than resenting this inequality, they embraced it as motivation. They would not just be as good as white pilots, they would be better. Marshall graduated from the program in June 1943, receiving his pilot's wings and commission as a second lieutenant. The ceremony was bittersweet. Proud families celebrated their sons' achievements, while knowing those achievements came despite, rather than because of, their country's values. The newly commissioned pilots knew they would be fighting a war on two fronts, against the enemy abroad and against prejudice at home. The 332nd Fighter Group deployed to Italy in early 1944, establishing operations at Ramitelli Airfield near the Adriatic coast. Their primary mission was bomber escort, flying protective formations around the heavy bombers that struck at enemy industrial targets, oil facilities, and transportation networks. It was demanding, dangerous work that required discipline, situational awareness, and split-second decision-making. Marshall flew his first combat mission in February 1944. The experience was everything the training had prepared him for, and nothing like he had imagined. The intellectual understanding of aerial combat gave way to visceral reality, the G-forces of hard turns, the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears, the sudden appearance of enemy aircraft that had been invisible moments before. He returned from that first mission with a new appreciation for the difference between training and combat, and with a determination to learn from every flight. Over the following months, Marshall established himself as one of the squadron's most reliable pilots. His logbook filled with mission entries, escort duties to targets across Germany and occupied Europe, strafing runs against enemy airfields and transportation, reconnaissance flights over hostile territory. He learned to read weather, to manage fuel consumption, to coordinate with fellow pilots through brief radio calls and hand signals. Most importantly, he learned to stay alive in an environment where mistakes were usually fatal. By March 1945, Marshall had flown 83 combat missions. He had been promoted to captain and served as a flight leader, responsible not just for his own survival, but for the success and safety of the pilots who flew with him. His reputation within the group was solid, methodical, professional, innovative when necessary but never reckless, the kind of pilot you wanted leading your formation into dangerous airspace. The morning briefing on March 22nd had introduced the problem that would lead to Marshall's innovation. Major William Campbell, the squadron operations officer, had stood before the assembled pilots with visible frustration etched into his features. The briefing room at Ramitelli was spare but functional. Rough wooden walls, a potbelly stove that fought a losing battle against the morning chill, folding chairs arranged in rows before a large map of northern Italy and southern Austria. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with grease pencil notations tracking friendly and enemy positions, supply routes, defended areas, and targets of interest. Campbell was a veteran of 72 combat missions, a man whose judgment had been earned through experience rather than granted through rank alone. His uniform bore the creases of countless briefings, and his eyes held the particular weariness that came from sending young men into danger day after day, knowing that some would not return. When he spoke, pilots listened not just because of his rank, but because they trusted his experience. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Campbell began without preamble. "The German forces in northern Italy are maintaining a level of logistical support that should be impossible given their current situation. Despite our interdiction efforts, despite the collapse of their supply lines elsewhere, they continue to receive substantial amounts of equipment, ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Intelligence has traced the source to nighttime train movements through the Brenner Pass." He paused to let that sink in. Every pilot in the room understood the significance. The Brenner Pass was one of the most important mountain corridors in Europe, a natural gateway between Austria and Italy that had been used for trade and military movement since ancient times. Control of the pass meant control of supply lines that could sustain entire armies. Campbell continued, his frustration evident. "Our reconnaissance flights during daylight hours have found nothing. The rail lines appear empty, abandoned almost. But we know from intelligence sources that trains are moving through the pass every night. They must be hiding the rolling stock during the day, but we have not been able to determine where or how. Conventional bombing missions have proven ineffective. We cannot hit targets we cannot see, and the mountainous terrain makes blind bombing against suspected locations a waste of ordnance." The assembled pilots shifted in their seats. This was not a simple escort mission or a straightforward ground attack. This was a puzzle, and puzzles required thought as much as courage. Campbell outlined what intelligence knew and, more importantly, what they did not know. The German forces had clearly developed a system for concealing their trains during daylight hours, when they would be vulnerable to air attack. The system was effective enough that months of reconnaissance had failed to locate the hidden rolling stock. Traditional high-altitude observation provided insufficient detail. Medium-altitude observation faced intense defensive fire. And no one had seriously considered low-altitude reconnaissance because the risks seemed to outweigh potential benefits. Captain Marshall sat in the third row, his notebook open on his lap, listening intently and taking occasional notes. At 26 years old, he had learned that solutions to difficult problems often required questioning basic assumptions. Everyone assumed that reconnaissance had to be conducted at safe altitudes. But what if safe altitudes were precisely the problem? What if the key to finding the hidden trains was to look at the pass from an entirely different perspective? After the briefing, Marshall lingered while other pilots dispersed to prepare for the day's scheduled missions. He approached Campbell as the Major was gathering his maps and notes. "Sir, may I ask a question about the Brenner Pass reconnaissance?" Campbell looked up, his expression suggesting he welcomed any ideas at this point. "Go ahead, Captain." Marshall chose his words carefully. "All of our reconnaissance has been conducted at medium to high altitude for safety reasons. That makes sense given the terrain and defensive positions, but it also means we are always looking down at the valley from an angle that makes distinguishing details difficult. What if the solution is not to fly higher and use better cameras, but to fly lower and use direct observation?" Campbell's expression shifted from interest to concern. "Captain, the Brenner Pass has mountains rising over 6,000 feet on both sides. Flying at low altitude through that terrain is not just dangerous, it is nearly suicidal. The margins for error are measured in feet. One gust of wind, one moment of distraction, and you fly directly into a mountainside. I understand the risk, sir, but consider what we gain. At low altitude, flying parallel to the rail line rather than perpendicular to it, we can see into tunnel entrances. We can observe details that are invisible from above, spur tracks, switching points, any irregularities that might indicate concealed facilities. The German forces have invested significant effort in camouflage that works against aerial observation from traditional altitudes. But that camouflage may be ineffective against observation from ground-level perspective." Campbell studied the younger pilot, weighing the tactical value against the risk to valuable aircraft and pilots. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven themselves repeatedly, earning a reputation for skill and determination that had silenced many of their critics. But this request pushed boundaries even by their aggressive standards. "You are asking me to authorize what amounts to contour flying through one of the most dangerous mountain passes in Europe," Campbell said slowly. "If something goes wrong, we lose not just an aircraft but one of our most experienced pilots. I need to know this is more than just educated guesswork, Captain. Convince me this has a reasonable chance of success." Marshall had anticipated this question. He opened his notebook to a page filled with observations from previous missions. "Sir, I have been keeping records of our reconnaissance missions over the past 3 months. I have noticed patterns in how the German forces use camouflage and concealment. They are very good at hiding things from overhead observation. They understand angles, shadows, how to make artificial structures blend with natural terrain when viewed from above. But their defenses are optimized for the threats they expect. No one has attempted systematic low-altitude observation because everyone assumes it is too dangerous. That assumption may be their vulnerability." He flipped to another page. "Additionally, sir, the morning hours offer specific advantages. The sun rises in the east, which means if we approach from the south heading north through the pass, we have the sun behind us. That improves our visibility while creating glare for any defensive positions trying to track us. The air is typically calmer in the morning, reducing turbulence in the mountain valleys. And most importantly, if the German forces are moving trains at night and concealing them at dawn, morning reconnaissance gives us the best chance of observing movements before everything is hidden." Campbell listened to the analysis with growing respect. This was not a reckless pilot looking for glory. This was a professional identifying vulnerabilities in enemy defensive measures and proposing tactics to exploit them. The Tuskegee Airmen had learned long ago that they could not afford to be reckless. Every mission had to demonstrate competence. Every risk had to be calculated and justified. "All right, Captain," Campbell said finally. "I will authorize one low-altitude reconnaissance flight. You can take Lieutenant Tucker as your wingman. Your mission parameters are as follows: maintain altitude below 500 feet, follow the rail line through the pass from south to north, observe and document anything that appears anomalous. Do not engage any targets. This is strictly reconnaissance. If you discover where they are hiding their trains, we can plan appropriate follow-up action. If this proves too dangerous or yields nothing useful, We return to conventional approaches. Understood? Understood, sir. When would you like us to conduct this flight? Tomorrow morning, dawn. I want you over the pass just as the sun is coming up. That gives you the lighting advantages you mentioned and coincides with when they would be completing their nighttime movements. Marshall nodded, already mentally planning the flight profile, visualizing the approach, considering contingencies for equipment failure or unexpected conditions. This was his chance to prove that innovative thinking could solve problems that brute force could not. It was also, though he did not dwell on this aspect, another opportunity to demonstrate that the Tuskegee Airmen belonged in the same ranks as any pilots in the military. The rest of the day was spent in preparation. Marshall reviewed every available map of the Brenner Pass, studying the terrain, identifying landmarks that would help with navigation at low altitude where radio beacons were unreliable, and visual reference points became critical. He calculated fuel requirements for the mission profile. Slower speeds at low altitude meant higher fuel consumption per mile traveled. He reviewed the technical specifications of his P-51 Mustang, ensuring he understood the aircraft's performance characteristics at the altitudes he would be flying. Lieutenant James Tucker, who would fly as Marshall's wingman, was a 24-year-old pilot from St. Louis who had flown 49 combat missions. He was skilled, reliable, and calm under pressure, exactly the kind of pilot you wanted beside you when attempting something unconventional. When Marshall briefed him on the mission, Tucker's reaction was measured. Flying through a narrow mountain pass at low altitude with enemy defensive positions on all sides, what could possibly go wrong? Marshall smiled slightly at the sarcasm. Everything, potentially. Which is why we fly the profile exactly as planned, with no deviations unless absolutely necessary. I lead. You maintain position on my wing at 100 yards spacing. We follow the rail line, observe everything, record mentally what we see, and return to base. Simple reconnaissance, no heroics. And if we take fire, we are too low and too fast for accurate tracking from elevated positions. They would have to be very lucky or very good to hit us. Our speed is our defense. We do not slow down. We do not make multiple passes. We do not engage. We observe and we leave. Tucker nodded slowly. I trust your judgment, Bob. When you say we can do this, I believe you. Just promise me we are not going to discover why everyone else thought this was a bad idea. That is exactly what I intend to avoid discovering. That evening, Marshall wrote a letter to his parents. He did not mention the specific mission planned for the morning. Operational security forbade detailed descriptions of upcoming operations. But he wrote about his confidence in his skills, his appreciation for the training that had prepared him for this work, and his determination to prove that excellence was the only standard that mattered. He sealed the letter and left it with the squadron mail clerk, a routine he followed before every mission that seemed particularly challenging. Sleep came with difficulty. Marshall's mind kept running through the mission profile, visualizing the approach, considering scenarios and responses. Finally, around midnight, exhaustion overcame analysis, and he drifted into fitful sleep, filled with dreams of mountains and narrow valleys where navigation required perfect precision. The alarm woke him at 4:30 in the morning. The pre-dawn darkness outside offered no hint of the clear weather that was forecast. Marshall dressed in his flight suit, gathered his gear, and made his way to the mess tent, where early risers and night shift personnel gathered for coffee and whatever breakfast the cooks had prepared. The coffee was terrible, as always, but the warmth was welcome against the morning chill. Tucker joined him a few minutes later, looking alert despite the early hour. Ready for our mountain adventure? As ready as I will be. Weather looks good, aircraft are prepared, and we have a clear mission objective. Everything else is execution. They walked together to the flight line where ground crews were completing final checks on their aircraft. The P-51 Mustangs gleamed in the pre-dawn light, their polished aluminum skins reflecting the glow from work lights as crew chiefs performed their careful inspections. Marshall's aircraft bore the markings of the 332nd Fighter Group, a red tail that had become the iconic symbol of the Tuskegee Airmen's presence in the skies over Europe. Sergeant William Hayes, Marshall's crew chief, stood beside the aircraft with a clipboard and flashlight. Captain, we have gone over her completely. All systems check out. Fuel tanks are topped off. All 6 guns are loaded and armed, though you said this is reconnaissance only. Engine is running smooth, all instruments calibrated. She is ready to fly. Thank you, Sergeant. I will try to bring her back without any new holes. I would appreciate that, sir. Gives me less work to do. Marshall conducted his own walk-around inspection, a ritual he never skipped regardless of how much he trusted his crew chief. He checked control surfaces, landing gear, external stores, anything that might have been damaged or loosened since the previous flight. Satisfied, he climbed into the cockpit and began the startup procedure. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine came to life with its characteristic deep-throated roar, 12 cylinders firing in synchronized precision, over 1,400 horsepower waiting to be translated into speed and altitude. Marshall ran through his instrument checks, oil pressure, fuel flow, engine temperature, all readings normal. He tested his controls, watching the ailerons, elevator and rudder respond to his inputs. Everything felt right. Tucker's voice came through the radio. 2 is ready when you are, lead. Copy, 2. Let us go find some trains. They taxied to the runway in the pre-dawn darkness, their aircraft's navigation lights leaving trails of red and green in the gloom. Marshall advanced his throttle smoothly, feeling the Mustang accelerate down the runway, the tail coming up, and then the gentle lift as the aircraft transitioned from ground machine to flying machine. Tucker followed seconds later, sliding into formation as they climbed away from the airfield. The flight north across Italy provided time to settle into the rhythm of the mission. Marshall kept the formation at 8,000 feet, well above any terrain concerns, conserving fuel and allowing both pilots to relax before the demanding low-altitude work ahead. The sky ahead lightened gradually, transitioning from black to deep blue to the warm colors of approaching sunrise. As they approached the southern entrance to the Brenner Pass, Marshall began his descent. The altimeter unwound steadily, 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The mountains that had seemed distant and manageable suddenly became imposing walls rising on either side. Marshall leveled off at 3,000 feet, still well above the valley floor, but low enough to begin appreciating the scale of the terrain. All right, James, here we go. Descending to attack altitude, stay on my wing and keep your head on a swivel. 2 copies. I am with you. Marshall rolled into a gentle descent, his eyes constantly moving between the terrain ahead, his instruments and his position relative to the rail line that was now becoming visible below. The valley narrowed as they descended, the mountains seeming to close in from both sides. At 1,000 feet, the sense of confinement became pronounced. At 500 feet, it became intense. At 300 feet, it became absolute. The Brenner Pass at low altitude was an entirely different world from the safe distances of higher reconnaissance flights. The mountains rose like vertical walls, their peaks still crowned with snow that gleamed in the early morning light. The valley floor was a complex landscape of rocks, vegetation, the rail line itself snaking through the terrain, and occasional structures associated with the railway. Everything passed at tremendous speed. At the reduced velocity Marshall was maintaining for observation purposes, they were still covering nearly 3 miles every minute. The first tunnel entrance appeared ahead. Marshall forced himself to observe methodically, rather than react emotionally to the dramatic scenery. The tunnel was large, reinforced with concrete at the entrance, the rail line disappearing into darkness. Nothing unusual about the structure itself. But as they flashed past, Marshall noticed something. The rock face beside the tunnel entrance showed signs of recent work, patches where the natural weathering did not match the surrounding stone. He made a mental note and continued scanning. The second tunnel entrance showed similar characteristics, nothing overtly suspicious, but subtle signs that someone had been working to modify the appearance of the terrain around the rail infrastructure. The third tunnel entrance was different. As Marshall approached, flying parallel to the rail line barely 200 feet above the valley floor, he noticed a switching point where the tracks branched. One branch led into the obvious tunnel entrance. The other branch appeared to dead end against a rock face that rose at a steep angle from the valley floor. James, do you see that spur track on the left? Follow it visually and tell me where it goes. Tucker's aircraft shifted slightly as the pilot altered his viewing angle. Lead, it looks like it just ends at the rock face, but wait, that rock face does not look quite right. The coloring is off, the texture is too uniform. I think that is camouflage netting or some kind of artificial covering. That is what I see too. Mark this location. I'm going to make one more pass for a closer look. Marshall banked his aircraft gently, circling back to approach from a different angle. This time he dropped even lower, bringing his Mustang down to barely 150 feet above the tracks. From this perspective, the deception became obvious. What appeared from altitude to be natural rock was actually an elaborate camouflage system. Netting that had been painted and textured to blend with the surrounding geology, draped over what was clearly another tunnel entrance. Confirmed, he radioed to Tucker. That is a concealed siding. The German forces are hiding trains in there during daylight hours. Let us continue up the pass and see how many more we can find. Over the next 40 minutes, flying the length of the Brenner Pass from south to north, Marshall and Tucker discovered 7 more concealed sidings. Each one was positioned to take advantage of natural rock formations that provided overhead protection from aerial bombardment. The camouflage was sophisticated, clearly the work of engineers who understood how aerial reconnaissance was conducted. But from the low altitude that Marshall was flying, with the sun angle providing optimal lighting, the deceptions failed. He could see the subtle differences in texture, the slightly too regular patterns that nature would never create, the signs of recent construction hidden beneath the camouflage. As they completed their pass through the northern end of the pass and began climbing back to safe altitude, Marshall felt a surge of satisfaction. The mission had worked exactly as he had hoped. They had found what months of conventional reconnaissance had missed, and they had done it by approaching the problem from a direction the enemy had not anticipated. The flight back to Ramitelli was uneventful. Marshall used the time to organize his observations, preparing for the debrief that he knew would follow immediately upon landing. He had accomplished the reconnaissance objective. Now the challenge would be convincing command that these hidden sidings could be effectively engaged. They landed at Ramitelli just after 8 in the morning. Before Marshall had even completed his post-flight inspection, Major Campbell was walking across the flight line toward them, accompanied by several intelligence officers. The expression on Campbell's face suggested he had been monitoring their radio transmissions and was eager to hear details. The debrief took place in the operations room, with Marshall and Tucker providing detailed accounts of everything they had observed. Marshall sketched the locations of the concealed sidings on maps, described the camouflage systems, and estimated the capacity of each hidden facility. The intelligence officers asked penetrating questions, wanting to understand exactly what the pilots had seen and how confident they were in their assessments. Lieutenant Morrison, the thin intelligence officer with round spectacles who had attended the previous briefing, studied Marshall's sketches with intense interest. "Captain, this explains everything. We have been looking for trains on the tracks when they are actually hidden in these mountainside sidings. The question now becomes how we engage these targets effectively. They are protected from overhead attack by rock and camouflage, and the narrow confines of the pass make traditional bombing approaches nearly impossible." Marshall had been anticipating this question. He had spent much of the return flight considering tactics for engaging the targets he had discovered. "Sir, I believe the same approach that allowed us to find these sidings provides the solution for engaging them. We cannot attack from altitude, but we can attack from the deck using the same low-level profile we flew for reconnaissance." Campbell's expression shifted to concern. "Captain, you are talking about conducting ground attack runs at extremely low altitude through mountainous terrain, while defensive positions engage you. That is exponentially more dangerous than what you did this morning." "I understand, sir. But consider the alternatives. High-altitude bombing will be inaccurate and ineffective against these small protected targets. Medium-altitude bombing will face intense defensive fire and still struggle with accuracy given the terrain. Dive bombing would be suicidal in the confined space of the pass. But if we come in low, following the rail line, just as we did for reconnaissance, we can engage each siding with direct fire from our guns. The P-51 carries 650 caliber machine guns that can put devastating firepower on target at close range," Lieutenant Morrison interjected. "Captain Marshall, I appreciate your innovative thinking, but what you are describing requires hitting targets measured in feet, not yards. While flying at high speed through a narrow valley with mountains on both sides, and enemy defensive positions shooting at you. The margin for error is almost non-existent. That is true, sir. But we have advantages the enemy does not expect. First, the low altitude that seems like our vulnerability is actually our protection. Defensive positions on the mountain slopes cannot depress their weapons enough to track targets so low in the valley. Their fields of fire are optimized for aircraft at medium altitude. Second, our speed makes us difficult targets, even for positions that can engage us. We will be visible for only seconds before passing out of effective range. Third, we can attack in coordinated pairs. One aircraft suppresses defensive positions, while the second focuses on the primary target. Then they reverse roles. Campbell looked at the maps, considering the tactical proposal. The room fell silent as the senior officer weighed risk against potential reward. Finally he spoke. "I will authorize a trial mission against one of these sidings. You will lead a flight of 4 aircraft. Your objective is to collapse the tunnel entrance, trapping whatever rolling stock is inside and denying the enemy use of that facility. If you can accomplish this without unacceptable losses, we will evaluate expanding the operation. If the cost is too high, we return to conventional approaches. Do you accept those terms?" "I do, sir." "Then prepare your flight. Mission is tomorrow morning, same time as today's reconnaissance. Brief your pilots thoroughly, Captain. They need to understand exactly what they are getting into." The rest of the day was spent in detailed mission planning. Marshall selected his flight carefully. Lieutenant Tucker, who had flown with him that morning and understood the terrain and tactics. Lieutenant Raymond Foster, a stocky pilot from Detroit with 57 missions to his credit and a reputation for cool-headedness under fire. And Lieutenant Charles Dixon, the youngest of the group at 23, but possessing natural flying ability that made up for his limited experience. Marshall gathered his flight in a quiet corner of the operations room and began the briefing with unusual formality. "Gentlemen, before I brief this mission, I need each of you to understand what we are attempting. This is unlike any ground attack mission our group has flown. We will be operating at extremely low altitude in confined terrain. We will be engaging targets that require precision placement of fire. We will be vulnerable to defensive weapons during our attack runs. If anyone has reservations about this mission, now is the time to express them without any judgment." Foster spoke first. "Bob, I have flown on your wing enough times to trust your judgment. If you say this can be done, I believe you. What I need from you is a clear understanding of the tactics so I know exactly what my role is." "Fair enough. Charles, James, anything to add?" Tucker nodded. "I was with Bob this morning. I saw the targets, I understand the terrain, and I agree that this approach can work. But Raymond is right. We need to brief this thoroughly so everyone knows exactly what to expect." Dixon looked uncertain but determined. "I am in, Captain. I trust your experience. I just need you to walk me through this step by step." Marshall spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that. Using maps, sketches, and detailed descriptions, he painted a complete picture of what they would encounter. He described the approach to the target, how they would enter the pass at altitude, descend to attack altitude only when they were committed to the run, maintain formation discipline throughout. He explained the attack sequence, how they would operate in 2 ship elements, with one aircraft suppressing defensive positions while the other engaged the primary target. He emphasized speed control. Too fast and we overshoot the target, too slow and we become easy targets ourselves. We need to maintain around 250 miles per hour during the attack run. That is fast enough to be a difficult target, but slow enough to allow accurate shooting. He discussed weapon employment. Our 650 caliber machine guns are devastating weapons at close range. We do not need to destroy the tunnel entrance completely. We just need to cause enough structural damage that it collapses or becomes unusable. Focus your fire on the concrete reinforcement around the tunnel mouth. Aim for the junction between the concrete and natural rock. That is the structural weak point. He addressed defensive fire. You will see muzzle flashes from mountain positions. Do not fixate on them. Our speed and the terrain make us difficult targets. Keep your focus on the primary objective. If we allow defensive fire to distract us, we lose the precision that makes this tactic viable. Foster raised a practical question. What if we take damage? At that altitude, we have no room to maneuver, no altitude to trade for speed if our engine is hit. Marshall nodded. acknowledging the reality. If your aircraft is damaged and cannot maintain flight, you focus on one thing only: gaining enough altitude to bail out safely. We will be operating over Allied-friendly territory, so any pilot who has to leave his aircraft has a reasonable chance of reaching friendly lines. But our best defense is not getting hit in the first place, which means flying this mission exactly as briefed. They reviewed the mission profile repeatedly until each pilot could describe every phase without hesitation. They discussed contingencies. What if weather changed? What if they encountered unexpected enemy aircraft? What if defensive fire proved heavier than anticipated? Marshall wanted his pilots thinking through scenarios ahead of time rather than improvising under pressure. Dixon asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Captain, do you really think we can pull this off?" Marshall looked at the young pilot directly. "Charles, I never suggest missions that I do not believe are achievable. This will be difficult, and it will require perfect execution from all of us. But yes, I believe we can do this. The question is whether we can do it without mistakes, because mistakes at low altitude in mountainous terrain are usually fatal. That is why we brief thoroughly, why we plan carefully, and why we execute precisely." That evening, the 4 pilots walked out to the flight line together to inspect their aircraft. The ritual was partly practical. Each pilot wanted to personally verify that his machine was ready, and partly psychological. There was something reassuring about seeing the 4 Mustangs lined up, their red tails gleaming in the setting sun, ready to be instruments of precision warfare the next morning. Sergeant Hayes and his fellow crew chiefs had prepared the aircraft with meticulous care. Ammunition had been loaded, a specific mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds that would provide maximum effectiveness against the concrete and rock of the tunnel entrance. Fuel tanks were topped off. Every system had been checked and rechecked. The aircraft were as ready as human hands could make them. Marshall ran his hand along the leading edge of his Mustang's wing, feeling the smooth metal, appreciating the engineering excellence that had created this remarkable machine. The P-51 represented the pinnacle of piston-engine fighter design, fast, maneuverable, long-ranged, and deadly. Tomorrow morning, he would push this aircraft to the limits of its performance envelope, asking it to do things its designers had probably never envisioned. That night, Marshall again struggled with sleep. His mind kept running through the mission, visualizing the approach, imagining the sequence of events. Unlike the night before, these were not anxious thoughts, but the mental rehearsal that elite performers use to prepare for challenging events. He saw himself lining up on the target, felt his hands making the precise control inputs, heard the hammering of his machine guns as he placed fire on the tunnel entrance. Finally, around midnight, he drifted into deep sleep. His dreams were vivid, flying through mountain valleys where the peaks seemed to reach toward the stars, where precision and error were separated by inches, where success required perfect harmony between pilot and machine. He woke at 4:30 to his alarm, feeling rested despite the abbreviated sleep, his mind already focused on the mission ahead. The pre-dawn routine repeated itself: dressing, breakfast of terrible coffee and tolerable food, the walk to the flight line in darkness pierced by work lights, the careful inspection of aircraft, the startup procedure that brought 12 cylinders to roaring life. But this time there was added weight to every action. This was not reconnaissance but combat. This was not observation but engagement. This was the moment when theory would meet reality. The 4 Mustangs took off in sequence, forming up over the airfield before turning north toward the Alps. Marshall led the formation at comfortable altitude, using the transit time to let everyone settle into the rhythm of flight, to shake off any lingering tension, to prepare mentally for what was coming. As they approached the Brenner Pass, Marshall keyed his radio. "All aircraft, this is lead. We are beginning our descent in 2 minutes. Review your procedures one final time. Remember the briefing. We fly the profile exactly as planned. No improvisation, no heroics. We are here to do a job, and we are going to do it professionally. Everyone acknowledge. 2 copies, 3 ready, 4 understands." Marshall pushed his stick forward and began descending. The familiar sensation of the mountains rising to meet them returned, but this time with added intensity, because he knew what was coming. At 2,000 feet, He could see the rail line clearly. At 1,000 feet, he could identify specific landmarks. At 500 feet, the valley transformed into a narrow corridor walled by mountains. At 300 feet, flying barely above the treetops with mountains towering thousands of feet above on both sides, Marshall felt the peculiar clarity that came from complete focus. His entire consciousness narrowed to the immediate task: maintain altitude, follow the rail line, scan for the target, prepare for engagement. The concealed siding appeared ahead exactly where his reconnaissance flight had found it the previous morning. He armed his weapons, feeling the slight vibration as the guns were activated. Behind him, Tucker moved into position at 100 yards spacing. Foster and Dixon flew the second element, offset to provide mutual support. This is lead. Target ahead. Commencing attack run. Follow my tracers. Marshall pressed the gun button, and his P-51 Mustang shuddered as 6 streams of .50 caliber rounds reached out toward the tunnel entrance. The sound was tremendous, a hammering roar that penetrated even the noise-canceling properties of his helmet. The tracers drew bright lines through the morning air, converging on the concrete reinforcement around the tunnel mouth. He held the trigger for 3 seconds, watching his rounds tear into the target. Concrete chips exploded outward. Dust billowed. The camouflage netting shredded under the impact. He released the trigger and pulled back on the stick, climbing away from the target area to give Tucker room for his run. 2 is in hot. Tucker's guns added their voice to the attack, his rounds impacting almost exactly where Marshall's had struck. Behind them, Foster positioned for his run. Defensive fire erupted from elevated positions on both sides of the valley. Marshall saw muzzle flashes, heard the distinctive crack of rounds passing nearby. But as he had predicted, the steep angles made accurate fire difficult. Most rounds passed overhead or wide of their targets. 3 is engaging. Foster's run was textbook perfect, his rounds walking across the target with methodical precision. Dixon followed seconds later, his youth and eagerness translating into slightly more aggressive firing, holding the trigger longer than strictly necessary, but achieving solid hits on the target. Marshall banked back around, assessing the damage. The tunnel entrance showed significant damage. The concrete facing was cracked in multiple places, and he could see where the structure had begun to fail. But it was not a complete collapse. They had wounded the target, but not defeated it. All aircraft, reform on me. We are going to make one more pass and finish this. The second attack run was even more intense than the first. The defensive positions were fully alert now, their fire more concentrated. But the 4 Mustangs coordinated their attack perfectly, each pilot placing his fire with precision, born from training and focus. By the time Dixon completed his second run, the tunnel entrance was clearly compromised. Major sections of the concrete reinforcement had collapsed inward, and rockfall from above had begun adding to the obstruction. All aircraft, break off and climb to safe altitude. Mission accomplished. As they climbed away from the pass, Marshall felt the tension drain away, replaced by satisfaction and relief. They had done it, proven that the tactic was viable, that precision low-altitude attack could achieve what conventional bombing could not. That innovative thinking, backed by defeated execution, could solve seemingly impossible problems. The return flight to Ramitelli was jubilant but professional. The 4 pilots maintained formation discipline, conserved fuel, and monitored their instruments. There would be time for celebration, after they had safely returned to base, after they had debriefed the mission, after they had given their commanders the information needed to evaluate the operation's success. They landed without incident, completing their post-flight procedures with the care that had become second nature. Major Campbell was waiting again, this time with a broader group of senior officers. The debrief was extensive, with each pilot providing detailed observations about the attack, the effectiveness of their weapons, the intensity of defensive fire, and the damage they had observed. Reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched that afternoon to photograph the target. The images confirmed what Marshall had observed. The tunnel entrance was extensively damaged, with structural collapse making it unusable without major repair work. Intelligence estimated it would take the German forces weeks to clear the debris and rebuild the entrance. If they had the resources and time to attempt such repairs, given their deteriorating strategic situation. Major Campbell addressed Marshall privately after the formal debrief. "Captain, you have accomplished something remarkable. You identified a problem that had frustrated Allied air operations for months, developed an innovative solution, and carried out it flawlessly. This is going to change how we conduct interdiction operations in mountainous terrain. More immediately, this is going to seriously disrupt enemy logistics through the Brenner Pass. Thank you, sir. But the credit belongs to the entire flight. This worked because 4 pilots carried out a difficult mission with precision. I understand that, Captain. But leadership means identifying opportunities and having the courage to pursue them, even when others consider them too risky. You did both. Now the question is how we expand this success. Over the next 2 weeks, Marshall led 11 more missions against the concealed sidings in the Brenner Pass. Each mission refined the tactics slightly. Approach angles were adjusted, weapons employment was optimized, coordination between aircraft became increasingly sophisticated. The success rate was remarkable. 10 of the 11 missions achieved their objectives, with only 1 mission aborting due to unexpected weather conditions. The impact on German logistics was immediate and substantial. Intelligence reports documented the growing disruption to supply movements through the pass. Trains that had previously moved freely during nighttime hours were now vulnerable throughout their journey. The German forces attempted to repair damaged sidings, but each repair effort was met with another precision strike. By mid-April, the Brenner Pass had become nearly unusable as a reliable supply route. Lieutenant Foster captured the significance during one evening discussion with fellow pilots. "We have done more damage to enemy logistics with machine gun fire and tactical innovation than heavy bomber formations achieved with thousands of tons of ordnance. That should tell you something about the value of thinking differently." But Marshall's achievement extended beyond tactical success. Throughout their service, the Tuskegee Airmen had faced persistent questions about their capabilities. They had been told, often explicitly, that black pilots lacked the intelligence, skill, and courage to match white pilots. Every mission was not just a military operation, but a refutation of that prejudice. Every innovation was proof that excellence transcended race. The low-altitude precision attacks on the Brenner Pass sidings became a case study in tactical innovation. Military strategists analyzed the operations, identifying lessons that would influence air-to-ground tactics for decades. The emphasis on detailed reconnaissance, the willingness to question conventional approaches, the coordination required for precision strikes in challenging terrain, all became elements of standard training. Lieutenant James Tucker, reflecting on those missions years later, provided important perspective. Bob Marshall was not trying to prove anything about race when he developed that tactic. He was trying to solve a problem that needed solving. But in solving it brilliantly, he proved everything that needed proving. He showed that a Tuskegee Airman could outthink, outplan, and out-execute anyone. He demonstrated that innovation could come from unexpected places, and he made it impossible for anyone to claim that black pilots were somehow less capable than their white counterparts. The spring of 1945 brought rapid changes to the situation in Europe. German forces were in retreat on multiple fronts, their supply lines increasingly disrupted, their ability to maintain organized resistance crumbling. The missions against the Brenner Pass continued, but with decreasing frequency as the strategic situation evolved. By late April, there were simply fewer targets worth engaging. The German transportation network had collapsed to the point where even protected sidings saw little use. On May 2, 1945, German forces in Italy formally surrendered. 6 days later, the conflict in Europe ended entirely. Captain Robert Marshall flew his final combat mission on May 7th, a routine patrol that found no enemy activity, no targets of opportunity, just empty sky and a landscape beginning its transition from battlefield to peacetime. Marshall's final combat statistics were impressive by any standard. 106 sorties flown without loss of a wingman, numerous successful ground attacks, and the tactical innovation that had solved a logistics problem that had frustrated Allied commanders for months. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership and tactical achievements, the citation specifically noting his innovative approach to the Brenner Pass operations. But the most important recognition was less formal and more meaningful. The success of the Tuskegee Airman, demonstrated through countless missions and numerous individual achievements like Marshall's, played a crucial role in the eventual integration of the United States military. Their combat record made it impossible to sustain arguments about racial limitations in military service. They had proven through performance that could not be denied that skin color had nothing to do with capability. Marshall returned to civilian life in late 1945, using benefits from military service to pursue an engineering degree. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. He married, raised a family, and built a successful career as an aerospace engineer, contributing to projects that pushed the boundaries of aviation technology. But occasionally, when pressed by students or historians researching the Tuskegee Airmen, Marshall would share reflections about what those experiences had meant. Flying fighters during the conflict taught me that problems have solutions if you are willing to look at them from new angles. Everyone said those hidden sidings could not be attacked effectively, but that was only true if you accepted conventional approaches as the only option. The moment you question assumptions, you open possibilities. He would pause, his expression thoughtful. And you know what the real trick was? It was not just the flying, though that was important. It was the thinking. Anyone can learn to fly an aircraft given enough time and training. The harder skill is learning to see what others miss, to imagine what others consider impossible, and to execute what others consider too risky. That is what made the difference. In 1995, 50 years after his missions over the Brenner Pass, Marshall attended a reunion of Tuskegee Airmen in Washington. The gathering brought together veterans from across the country, men who had served in different squadrons, flown different missions, but shared the common bond of having proved their worth against those who doubted them. During the reunion, a young Air Force officer approached Marshall with visible excitement. The officer introduced himself as Lieutenant Kevin Grant, a fighter pilot currently flying F-15 Eagles. He explained that he had studied Marshall's Brenner Pass tactics at the Air Force Academy, analyzing the operations as an example of innovative tactical thinking. "Sir, your approach to that problem changed how the Air Force thinks about precision strike operations. The principles you demonstrated, detailed reconnaissance, matching tactics to terrain, using your strengths against enemy weaknesses, those are still taught as fundamental concepts." Marshall listened with characteristic humility. "Lieutenant, may I ask a question? When you studied those operations at the Academy, did your instructors mention that the pilot who developed those tactics was a Tuskegee Airman?" Grant paused uncomfortably. "Sir, to be honest, they did not emphasize that aspect. They taught us the tactics, the analysis, the lessons learned, but the focus was on the operational success rather than the specific background of the pilots involved." Marshall nodded slowly, then smiled. "That is actually the greatest compliment they could have given me. It means the tactics stood on their own merit, without needing to be explained or qualified by the race of the man who created them. That is what we were fighting for. Not special recognition, but equal evaluation. If my work is judged solely on its effectiveness, then we succeeded in more ways than one." The young officer's expression showed understanding. "With respect, sir, I think people should know the full story. Not to diminish the tactics, but to inspire others. When students learn that innovation can come from anyone regardless of background, it opens their minds to possibilities they might otherwise dismiss." Marshall considered this perspective carefully. "You may be right, Lieutenant. Perhaps the time for anonymity has passed and the time for complete history has arrived. Tell the story, if you wish. Tell them about the Tuskegee Airmen, who proved that excellence knows no color. Tell them about pilots who faced not just the enemy, but also the prejudice of their own country, and who defeated both through skill and courage. And tell them that when someone says something cannot be done, they should remember that innovation often comes from those who have no choice but to find a new way." In his later years, Marshall occasionally visited schools to speak about his experiences. He would show photographs of his P-51 Mustang, explain the technical challenges of low-altitude flight in mountainous terrain, and answer questions about what it was like to fly combat missions during the conflict. But he always placed his individual achievements in the larger context of the Tuskegee Airmen's collective accomplishment. "We were not heroes in the traditional sense," he would tell students. "We were men doing our jobs under difficult circumstances. What made us noteworthy was not that we were better than other pilots. We were not, though we were certainly very good. What made us noteworthy was that we had to be excellent just to be given the chance to prove we were capable. That standard, that requirement to exceed expectations just to be accepted, pushed us to develop skills and techniques that might not have emerged under normal circumstances. He would pause, ensuring his audience understood the complexity of what he was saying. I am not grateful for the racism we faced. It was wrong, it was cruel, and it damaged countless lives. But I am proud of how we responded to that injustice. We responded not with bitterness alone, but with excellence. We turned their doubt into our motivation, and we proved them wrong in the most definitive way possible, through demonstrated competence that could not be denied or dismissed. The historical record of the Brenner Pass operations eventually became more complete, as classified documents were declassified and military historians conducted detailed research. The picture that emerged showed just how significant Marshall's tactical innovations had been. German logistics records captured after the conflict revealed that the disruption to supply movements through the pass had contributed materially to the collapse of German defensive positions in northern Italy. One captured document, written by a German transportation officer in April 1945, described the situation with stark clarity. We can no longer rely on the Brenner Pass for systematic supply movement at any hour. The American fighter aircraft have developed techniques for attacking our concealed positions that we cannot effectively counter. Each repair effort is met with renewed strikes. Our ability to sustain forces in the southern sector has been severely compromised. Without reliable logistics through the mountain passes, our defensive positions cannot hold. The document made no mention of the race of the pilots conducting these attacks. To the German officer, they were simply American fighters employing devastatingly effective tactics. It was a form of color-blind recognition that Marshall and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen had earned through performance alone. Lieutenant Raymond Foster, who had flown many of those missions on Marshall's wing, later became a commercial airline pilot. In a speech to a group of aspiring black aviators in 1972, he shared his perspective on what those wartime experiences had meant beyond their immediate military value. When we flew those missions over the Alps, we were not thinking about civil rights or breaking barriers. We were thinking about airspeed, altitude, target acquisition, and getting home alive. But in hindsight, every mission was a civil rights demonstration. Every successful strike was an argument against segregation. Every innovation was proof that talent and intelligence are distributed without regard to race. We were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against a foreign enemy and one against domestic prejudice. And we won both, though the victory against prejudice took longer to fully achieve. Captain Robert Marshall passed away in 2003 at the age of 84. His funeral was attended by military officials from multiple services, fellow Tuskegee Airmen who traveled from across the country, and several generations of pilots who had been inspired by his story. The eulogy noted his distinguished flying cross, his 106 combat missions, and his tactical innovations that had influenced military doctrine. But it also noted his humility, his dedication to his family, his lifelong commitment to education and opportunity, and his quiet dignity in the face of recognition he had never sought. The speaker at the funeral was Lieutenant General Marcus Williams, himself a black officer, who had risen through the ranks of an integrated air force that the Tuskegee Airmen had helped create through their excellence. His words captured something essential about Marshall's legacy and its meaning for later generations. Bob Marshall never sought glory or fame. He sought solutions to problems. When others saw impossibility, he saw challenge. When others accepted limitations, he questioned assumptions. His genius was not in being the best pilot, though he was certainly excellent. His genius was in being able to think beyond conventional approaches, to question what everyone else accepted as given. He looked at a mountain pass that had defeated all previous attempts at interdiction and asked a simple question: what if we flew lower instead of higher? What if we looked at the problem from an entirely different angle? That one question and the courage to pursue its answer changed everything. General Williams continued, his voice carrying both respect and emotion. But we honor Bob Marshall today not just for his tactical innovations or his combat record, however impressive those were. We honor him for what he represented, the principle that excellence should be the only criterion for opportunity. He and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen forced America to confront the contradiction between its stated values of equality and its practice of discrimination. They did not do this primarily through protests or speeches, though those played important roles in the broader civil rights movement. They did it through performance that could not be denied, excellence that could not be dismissed, and courage that could not be questioned. He paused, looking out over the assembled mourners. Every young black pilot who has earned wings since 1945 has flown in the slipstream of men like Bob Marshall. Every barrier that has fallen in the decades since was weakened by their example. Every person who believes in judging individuals by their abilities rather than their appearance stands on foundations they helped build. That is the legacy we celebrate today. Not just tactical innovation, but human progress achieved through demonstrated excellence. The ceremony concluded with a missing man formation flyover, 4 F-15 Eagles passing overhead in perfect formation, then one aircraft pulling up sharply and away, leaving a gap in the formation that would never be filled. It was a tribute reserved for fallen military aviators, acknowledging that there was now an empty place in the formation, a voice that would no longer respond to radio calls, a presence that existed now only in memory and legacy. Today, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is taught in schools across America, their collective achievement, training nearly 1,000 pilots, flying thousands of combat missions, earning hundreds of medals and maintaining one of the best combat records of any fighter group during the conflict, is recognized as a pivotal chapter in both military and civil rights history. Within that larger story, Captain Robert Marshall's innovation over the Brenner Pass stands as a specific example of how necessity, skill, and creative thinking can overcome challenges that seem insurmountable through conventional approaches. The lessons from those missions remain relevant decades later. In military academies and flight schools, instructors still teach the principles Marshall demonstrated: the value of detailed reconnaissance before engagement, the importance of matching tactics to terrain and target characteristics, the power of precision over brute force, and the necessity of questioning conventional wisdom when conventional approaches are failing to achieve objectives. But the lessons extend far beyond military application. Marshall's approach to problem-solving: observe carefully and systematically. Think creatively about solutions, question assumptions that everyone else takes for granted, and execute with precision once you have identified a viable approach, applies to challenges in every field and every context. His willingness to propose solutions that others considered too risky or unconventional speaks to the courage required for genuine innovation in any domain. And his success in the face of institutional prejudice reminds us that talent and capability exist in all communities, waiting only for opportunity and recognition. The mountains of the Brenner Pass remain today, unchanged by the passage of 8 decades. The rail line still runs through the valley, now carrying commercial traffic in a peaceful Europe that would have been unimaginable in 1945. The tunnel entrances that Marshall and his fellow pilots attacked with such precision have long since been repaired and rebuilt. There are no markers or memorials at those specific locations to indicate what happened there in the spring of 1945. But for those who know the history, who understand what those missions represented beyond their immediate tactical value, the mountains themselves serve as monuments. They stand as witnesses to a time when young men flew into danger armed only with skill and determination, when innovation emerged from necessity, and when excellence became the most powerful argument against prejudice. They remember mornings when the roar of Merlin engines echoed through the valleys, when machine gun fire echoed off rock walls, and when pilots proved that courage and capability recognize no boundaries of race or background. In the end, Captain Robert Marshall's risky low-altitude tactics against the hidden German trains did more than disrupt enemy logistics or demonstrate tactical innovation. However significant those accomplishments were in their military context, they added another chapter to a story that continues to unfold, the story of how barriers fall when met with competence, how prejudice crumbles before evidence, and how the pursuit of excellence opens doors that prejudice tried to weld shut. The 4 Mustangs that flew those first missions over the Brenner Pass carried more than bombs and bullets in their ammunition bays. They carried the hopes of a community that had been told they were not good enough, the determination of men who refused to accept limitations. Others tried to impose, and the courage to prove through action what words alone could never establish. They flew into the mountains, not just to strike at enemy targets, but to strike at the foundations of injustice itself. And in achieving their military objectives with skill and precision, they accomplished something even more significant for the longer term. They proved that the content of one's character and the quality of one's abilities matter more than the color of one's skin. They demonstrated that innovation and excellence can emerge from any community when given opportunity and recognition. And they showed that sometimes the most effective way to fight prejudice is not with words or protests alone, however necessary those may be, but with performance so exceptional that it silences all doubts and demolishes all objections. That is the enduring legacy of Captain Robert Marshall and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen, a legacy measured not just in military medals or tactical innovations, but in opened doors, expanded opportunities, and a more just society. Every black pilot who has served in the military since 1945 flies in the slipstream of those who first proved it was possible against all opposition. Every barrier that has fallen in the decades since was weakened by their example and their excellence. And every person who believes in judging individuals by their abilities rather than their appearance stands on foundations they helped build through their courage, skill, and determination. The mountains of the Brenner Pass keep their silence as mountains do, but history speaks loudly for those willing to listen. It tells of young men who faced overwhelming odds with courage and skill. It records innovations that changed military tactics and opened opportunities that had been closed. And it preserves the memory of pilots who proved that excellence recognizes no boundaries except those of determination, character, and the willingness to pursue what others consider impossible. When the sun rises over those mountains today, painting the peaks in shades of gold and orange as it did on that morning in March 1945, it illuminates more than just stone and ice and snow. It illuminates a legacy of courage, innovation, and triumph over injustice, a legacy that continues to inspire all who believe that what matters most is not where we come from, but where we have the courage and ability to go when given the opportunity to prove ourselves. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.